What up, Wizards? It's Dev from Mtg, aka the Aristocrats channel. Yeah, another format, another sack deck. At this point, I kind of feel like I'm doing this to you. Hey, buddy, it's dinner time again. Here you go, pal. Oh, man, spaghetti again? That's like the third time this week. Oh, actually, that's not spaghetti. That's spagooti. Spagooti. Basically, we do a lot of aristocrat stuff around here is what I'm trying to get at with that awful skit. I'm so sorry. Maybe one of the worst skits in the history of the channel. It's at least in the running, but still, everybody who's been around here a couple of times knows that I really like to sacrifice stuff. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I especially get jacked when I see a set that has somewhere around 147 new tools for an aristocrats deck, and one of them is this handsome devil. This guy, I've been doing the Bartman for a solid week now in the arena, just testing out different stuff with this deck, and I appear to be just about the only one. It's lonely out there. I haven't really seen anybody else play this card, which surprises me because I thought a whole bunch of people were excited for it. Apparently, it's just me out there testing stuff, and that's all I've been doing for the last week. Matter of fact, much like my 20th birthday party, I believe I did too much. So here's the deal. I'm not going to feed you spaghetti and call it spagooti. I'm just going to feed you a ton of spaghetti because in our time together, Bartolome and I have had many adventures, many incredible journeys that I cannot boil down into a singular experience. So today, we're going to do something we have never done on the channel. Get ready for a quadruple deck tech. Let's look at the aristocrats. And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech. Here I am. Yeah, you heard me back there. 4 decks. What of it? That's an awful lot to go over. So let's go ahead and jump to it right after you sub to the sandwich. Check out the Patreon. $1 a month is all it takes. I play Magic on Twitch. Blah, blah, blah. Not a whole lot of time for the creator call to action because we have got a lot to address. So let's go ahead and talk about our first deck. Traditional aristocrats, we'll call it. Now, I call it that because out of all the things that we're going to look at today, this is the most like a normal aristocrats deck that you usually think of when you call the deck to mind, right? The kind of mid-range adjacent synergy-driven combo-ish sort of pile that likes to get a ton of tokens into play, and then over the course of one big turn or 2 or 3 smaller turns, it sacks guys, finishes off the opponent with their dice triggers, or sometimes it just puts the opponent in a situation where they can't attack into your guys because then your guys die and then they die. So again, this is the most aristocrats of all the decks that we'll look at today. Now, even with that being the case, and with the fact that all 4 decks we'll look at today are very distinct from one another personality-wise, I still got to start by telling you that every deck in this video plays the same 10-card line to start things off. All 4 decks are going to play a playset of Bartolome del Presidio, and then 3 copies of Elisil Kor Sadistic Pilgrim, and 3 copies of Vron Executioner Thane. Now, of course, Bart is everything I want. He is everything I need. He has everything inside of me that I wish I could be. Just the perfect card that Aristocrats has been dreaming of, not just in Standard, but in multiple formats for years. This is one of the best free, repeatable sacrifice outlets in the history of the game. But of course, Bart's acquaintances are really important to this deck too. He's brought his lovely lady friend Elisil Kor, and look, I know, me and Elisil Kor, we have an understanding. We're supposed to be getting married and all that, but my heart will go on, especially knowing that she's met a guy this great. You can't deny they work really well together. Now, Elisil Kor is pretty obviously sweet for this pile, right? Part Soul Warden, part Blood Artist, and I love all that about her. But Vran I love too, because this guy decided, I'm not going to care at all about the Soul Warden part of this ability. I'm just going to spec all of my points into Super Blood Artist, which I really respect. Okay, so now we're all set up to start sacrificing guys and getting dice triggers and doing life loss to our opponent and getting this Rube Goldberg machine going that the deck gets its namesake from. It's actually from a joke that I probably can't even mention on YouTube without getting banned off the website, so I'm not going to do it. But one way or the other, we are ready to sacrifice some guys. Problem is we need some guys. What guys do we play? You know, it turns out we actually had a bunch of really good guys for this deck in Standard already. More on that as we move through the rest of these decks, because if there's one thing that changed the most throughout all of these lists, it's the 1-drops, but in this deck, I just used the ones that were really obvious, and it turns out they were really good in a traditional aristocrat shell. 4 copies of Market Gnome and 4 copies of Greedy Freebooter. I actually came to the conclusion throughout testing that Greedy Freebooter was the better of these 2 1-drops, but that said, Greedy Freebooter didn't end up in any other list that we'll look at today, but it is really good in this specific list. For one, basically every deck today can feel a little bit light on lands sometimes, so the treasure token really helps, but so does the scry, making sure that you hit your land drops when you need them. But Market Gnome over here, this will help brick wall aggro, which is actually really prominent in the format right now. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's kind of it feels like every deck is aggro now, so Market Gnome is great, not only because it can block for a couple of turns without dying, but when it does die in combat, it's going to gain you a life back. By the way, you draw a card too. Best part of the card. Not a whole lot of ways to draw cards in this deck, so Market Gnome is necessary. So those are some pretty good guys right there, obviously, but we do need more guys, I think. So I think the best way to achieve that is to play guys that bring more guys to the party. And normally that would be kind of irritating, but in this deck, it's exactly what we want. So we're going to play 4 copies of Wedding Announcement and 4 copies of Sanguine Evangelist. Now, somewhat surprisingly, I think at least, this is the only deck we'll look at today that plays play sets of both of these cards in the main deck. But this is, again, a kind of mid-rangey pile, so it benefits from the slow roll of a Wedding Announcement, and of course benefits from the Anthem effect that you get later, because it's going to have a whole bunch of creatures in play if it did the thing correctly. But I have to say here, I'm really impressed by Sanguine Evangelist. In a lot of cases, I felt like this was just better than Wedding Announcement, because Wedding Announcement is eventually going to give you 3 guys, but Sanguine Evangelist gives you 2 guys right now, and if you want 3 sacks right then and there, you get that out of this card too. It also makes flying power, which is kind of unbelievably important, more so than you might think, and the battle cry is good too, for getting in for that last big alpha strike when you have like a billion tokens on the table and you just want to get the damage through. Now on the token making front, I've also got a couple of one-ofs in the deck, forgive me. A single copy of Lord Skitter is in here, along with 1 copy of Jedar, Ghoul Caller of Nephalia. So Skitter will mess around in graveyards, and it's like the only card in the deck that does that, so it's really good for that some of the time, but mostly what this is going to do is just make a token every turn. A crappy little token that can't block, so some of the times the best thing you can do with it is just sacrifice it. Now Jedar does not come on a good body, it's just a 1/1, but this will also put like 3 power worth of stats into play on turn 2, and I couldn't find too many slots for the card, but I still wanted to play at least 1 copy of it because a free token every turn is a good deal. But hey, you ready for another one of? I'm playing a single copy of Sarah Paragon and another one in the sideboard. I think 2 is probably where you want to be, but not necessarily 2 in the main deck. I think the split is actually probably right. I didn't want to play too many 4-drops in this deck, and there are a lot of choices for 4-drops, as again we'll see as we go through these lists. But again, in the traditional Aristocrats deck, you might have thought it would have been Veto or Bloodletter of Aklazotz or something like that. Even Sheoldred is up for the title, but Radadrabik, there's a lot of legends in the deck. We'll get to all these later, but for the time being, I felt like in, again, these sort of mid-range, value-driven, grindy Aristocrats pile, Sarah Paragon was easily the best piece. But we got a few other cards to sacrifice dudes to. Bart can't be the only thing. Please don't put it all on Bart. He's got so much on his shoulders already. But anyway, we're playing 2 copies of Corrupted Conviction and 1 copy of Tarian's Journal. I originally started off on 4 copies of Corrupted Conviction. I was very excited about the turn 1 Greedy Freebooter into turn 2 Corrupted Conviction line, but it didn't work out as much as I wanted it to. Again, just had to remind myself that it's not Shambling Gas Deadly Dispute, it's Greedy Freebooter Corrupted Conviction, which is still very good, but not as good as I wanted it to be. That said, having a couple of 1 mana instant speed options to not necessarily save a creature from removal, but at least get 2 cards out of a creature that's going to be removed anyway is really sweet. And again, in case you don't have your Bard out, it's something to sack dudes to. But finally in the main deck, a couple of more things to sacrifice our dudes to. We're going to play 4 copies of Rite of Oblivion and 1 copy of Annihilating Glare. Okay, so there are a lot of sacrifice your guy and kill that thing cards in standard right now, right? We just got Dusk Rose Reliquary, which a lot of people, myself included, were freaking out about as a removal piece, and I do think that it's still a good removal piece, especially if you think like, oh, I can take out a token with Reliquary and then sacrifice the Reliquary to Bart and it doesn't matter, and yeah, that's cool, but it almost never actually happens. What you actually need is removal spells that stretch, because you don't have all of the spots in the world for removal because you're trying to get synergy over here. So you can really only play a few removal spells in your deck. That's where Rite of Oblivion, you start to realize that it's actually the best removal spell for an Aristocrats deck in the entire format by many, many miles, because this looks like we're only playing 5 removal spells. We're actually playing 9 removal spells. Overall, I had a lot of fun with this deck, but I've already sort of outlined some of the problems you come up against ramp. we're going to lose them matchups. The other big matchups in the format are mono red and other aggro decks like soldiers and mono white and stuff, which we actually tend to have the best chance against. So in this aggro dominated format in the first week of standard, this deck actually held its own very well. But when you come up against stuff like Esper, we don't do very well against that either, to be very honest, especially considering they have a few things that gain life, like Shieldred and Denick, and it turns out the decks that do that are actually tend to be kind of good against us because we're trying to count to 20 as quickly as possible with damage off of death triggers or whatever, and any life the opponent gains kind of throws that math off, and it sucks a little bit, especially when they're also attacking you and whatnot. So it's not, sometimes we lose tempo in those games, and Esper isn't the best matchup for us, especially when we need to resolve a spell in the late game. It's not great. So I threw this one back into the pile, went back to the drawing board, and tried to do something a little bit different. And to do that, I would have to reject tradition entirely and do something that I wouldn't have thought of doing before. Now, this deck plays the same line that we experienced in the first deck. I don't know that we experienced it, but one way or the other, we're playing the 4 Bart, the 3 Ellis, and the 3 Vron. But here's where everything divulges completely, and we start with 3 copies of Ratadrabic. I figured we're already playing 10 legends. Why don't we just play Ratadrabic and try to push in as many legends as we can while still adhering to this aristocrats theme? And I was kind of surprised how many we can do that with, because there's a ton of legends in Orzhov that, even though they may not look super aristocratsy, actually help a lot. For instance, every single one of these decks is going to need some kind of 1-drop, right? But in this deck, we ended up playing 3 copies of Skrelv, which we really don't want to sacrifice most of the time. But the other thing we don't want is to have our opponent remove all of our pieces, because, it takes a second to get an Elasilkor and a Vron and a Bartolome in play. So we kind of want to keep him in play, and Skrelv really helps us do that. In this deck, we're running Jadar and Lord Skitter again, but we're running twice as many. We can do that, it turns out, pretty consequence-free. So I'm just running 2 Jadar and 2 Lord Skitter. But there is another legend that makes tokens, actually, and it's a really, really good one. It's Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. We're going to play 3 copies of this, because it turns out there's some really sweet, turn 2 into turn 3 lines with Adeline. It also turns out that sometimes getting aggressive is exactly what this deck really wants to do. Just take a quick 10 points off the opponent's life total and then hit them for the last 8 to 10 damage with dice triggers and stuff. And Adeline also really helps you do that. And in the meantime, she gets super swole too, but I'm also playing 2 copies of Vito, Fanatic of Aklazats, in this deck. The only deck that Vito ended up in, I did consider a sort of Cavern of Soulsy vampire build that did some stuff, but actually, the one aristocrats deck I didn't make was vampires, but Vito still clawed his way into this because I was looking for premium legends that do aristocrat stuff, and Vito was like, oh, I'm the only one, actually. So, he got to come to the party this time. Aside from that, 3 Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Yeah, there's only a few non-creature cards in the entire deck. So I figured, why not make this a Thalia? Come on in here, girl. You're worth playing, right? This will throw a lot of opponents off their game, and we don't really have a whole lot of ways of interacting with them outside of our creatures in this deck. So every little bit of sort of even pseudo interaction counts, and Thalia is good for that. But to finish off the legends in the deck, there's a total of 29. It's kind of a lot. We're also playing 1 copy of Ayara. Yeah, that means if the Bartolome gets big enough, we can just fling it directly at the opponent's face. It's pretty good. Not a whole lot of creatures in this deck are going to get overly statted or anything, but Bartolome can get very big very fast and very big all of a sudden. So as soon as Ayara is able to tap, you can just win the game. Aside from that, I'm also playing 4 Sanguine Evangelists. Yeah, it's not even a legend. I'm just playing it in the deck. We got to juice some creatures out of our slots somehow, and a couple of Lord Skitters and a couple of Jadars just kind of isn't enough. So we need to have stuff in this deck that we can get a bunch of creatures all at once out of. Luckily, this is kind of the best card in standard for doing that. I'm coming to that conclusion. This card's really good. It's in every single deck today, and I think that there's only 3 other cards that have that distinction, right? That honor. So somehow this ended up just creeping its way into every single thing, and it's because Bart could not dream of a better card than this. But I'm also on 4 Rite of Oblivion. Now that I say things, I'm pretty sure this is also in every deck today. Again, there's just no better removal spell that aristocrats can play right now, and that is despite getting really good removal spells. In this last set, it doesn't matter. This was the best removal spell the whole time. Just play it, I'm telling you. Now this deck, I got to tell you, much like this lighting, was just bad. It was not a very good deck. I didn't have the highest hopes for it, but I wanted Ratadrabic to maybe do something cool from time to time, and he does from time to time. The highs with this deck are really, really high. Those games where you got a Ran out and an Ellis and a Bartolome and a Quadruple and a couple of other legends, maybe a Braids. If you want to play Braids, this deck could also play Braids. By the way, it's a really good card for a deck like this. Didn't elect to play it. I'm not sure it's actually very good, but I want to know from you if you elect to play it or if you elect to play this deck at all, because I didn't necessarily have the best experience with it. But when I was doing the crazy stuff, I felt really, really good about it. But that's marked by the taint of knowing that you're not going to do the cool thing as often as you really want to do the cool thing. So again, didn't have the highest hopes, but I at least wanted to stop here on the highway before I tried other stuff, and I'm glad that I did. So this time I decided to again do something a little bit different that I again did not have the greatest expectations for, but this time my expectations were finally succeeded rather than met, and meeting my expectations for an aristocrats deck is actually not necessarily a good thing. Hi, I'm in a different chair now again. I guess that's the gimmick for this video. You see, this time I decided to do something that might not sound super exciting to you, but amazingly was actually very good. It's life gain. Life gain aristocrats is good. Not something I thought I would hear myself saying, but here we are. I was pleasantly surprised by just how well this deck performed. Now, just like all the other decks today, this deck plays the 4 Bart, the 3 Ellis, and the 3 Vron, but you may have noticed that Vron and Ellis O'Core both gain life. Ellis O'Core, again, has that Soul Warden ability, and of course, Vron is a super blood artist in every single way. Not only does it deal extra damage to your opponent, but it also gains you extra life. So having all those life gain triggers just flying around is actually really sweet for one card in particular in Standard, and that's Amalia Benavides Aguirre, which we're playing 3 copies of here. Wait, I'm pointing over here. Are you actually over there? Yeah, she's going to be over there. Hey, Amalia. So I didn't think this card was great, and then I thought it might be great, and I said it was overrated, and then it ended up on my top 20 list. So I've really ping-ponged back and forth as far as what my true feelings are on this, but I do think in a Johnny's Primate that occasionally draws you a card and sometimes just finishes the game by itself is actually pretty good. I think that's a good card, especially when you've got a bunch of other stuff in your deck besides just the 2 blood artisty guys that gain you a bunch of life. In this deck, we're playing 4 copies of Market Gnome because that just kind of makes sense for a pile like this. But there's also 4 copies of Lunarch Vet in here, along with 4 copies of Extraction Specialist. It feels pretty good to play Soul Sisters in Standard. You start on turn 1 with Lunarch Veteran, turn 2 you play Ellis O'Core, and then eventually you play that Amalia, and you're just feeling really good about your life. You feel like you're playing Modern, it's a good time, but there's other sweet stuff in this deck too, like Market Gnome, which again is kind of an obvious call considering there's not a whole lot of stuff in this deck especially that draws you cards, but there are other ways to get card advantage like Extraction Specialist, which basically just draws a card out of your graveyard and throws it right onto the table. It also helps you get cards that you're not going to attack with anyway. Normally this is kind of a restriction, right? But I don't really want to attack with my Ellis. I don't really want to attack with my Vron, so I don't really feel too left out that I can't. But that's not all the life gain stuff in this deck. We've also got 3 copies of Ruin Lurker Bat and 2 copies of Steel Seraph, both kind of weird looking cards, but you'll know why Steel Seraph is in here. The moment you sacrifice all your guys when your opponent's tapped out, you give your Bart flying and you just kind of win the game. It happens way too much, but this also gives stuff lifelink pretty obviously, which is good in this deck. But I'm telling you, just the ability to give your huge guys flying or your huge Bart flying has made me kind of want to consider this card for the other versions of the deck. But in the life gain deck, I think you definitely play the 2. Now, Ruin Lurker Bat looks a little weird, but it's actually not the last deck that will see this card in today. It actually gets in damage fairly reliably. It's got the lifelink, so it procs those life gain triggers on Amalia. That's sweet. It blocks fairly well, and it helps you fix your draws if you're going to descend anyway by sacrificing guys. Might as well fix your draws, man. Just overall, the Bat was a pretty cool little card. But hey, guess what? There's also 4 copies of Sanguine Evangelist in this deck. Did you know that? I basically told you already that you're just going to see this in every deck because it's just really ridiculously impressively good, basically no matter what the build is trying to do. But this build is still trying to do kind of aristocracy stuff, you know, we're sacrificing guys, whatever. So it's just, again, great to have 1 card that juices 3 creatures into play basically immediately if that's what we need. But we're also playing 4 copies of Rite of Oblivion. Said that was in every deck, and I wasn't lying. See, it's there. Now, it turns out Amalia is a beast. It's a really Fantastic card, man. Like, even if it just like draws you the cards and doesn't like get huge over the course of a game, you kind of don't care. Like, if it draws you like 2 cards and you explored 3 or 4 times, then it's really doing its job. Also, I want to point out about Amalia that it contributes to all the damage that you're doing when your opponent tries to remove it, right? I said earlier, we're trying to count up to 20 with like dies, triggers, and stuff like that. 2 or 3 LSL cores triggers in one turn, plus a Vran trigger every turn or 2, right? So we're trying to count up to 20 doing that, and it can be a little difficult some of the time, but if they want to get rid of your Amalia with a single target removal spell, then suddenly they got to pay 3 life. And again, it all adds up, and sometimes really a bolt's worth towards the 20 life damage total that you're trying to get to. It's actually kind of a huge contribution, so I like that about it too. But ultimately, I'll say that I never did the thing with this. I never got it to 20 power, but that's because it doesn't need to get to 20 power. If it gets to a 5/5 or a 6/6, then your opponent has to deal with it before it draws you more cards or gets even bigger. And if they do want to deal with it, it's going to cost them some life one way or the other. So I was just really impressed by this card and this build in general, especially again, in a pretty aggro heavy format. But that said, this still wasn't the most profitable or best build that I put together. That is instead our last build. I guess we'll finish this one off sitting on the couch just like the old days. Is that fan service? I sure hope so. But at this point, I was really getting sick of all the aggro in the format. Even having just played a life gain deck, which was really good against aggro, I still decided there was too much aggro in the format. And if you can't beat them, join them. Even if you can beat them, join them. So that's when we decided to do what I thought at the time was the most harebrained thing I attempted yet. Yeah, I don't know how I thought building a traditional aggro deck was somehow more harebrained than life gain and legends. I don't know where my mind went there for a second, but this deck somehow surprised me, even though it's obviously it looked a pretty good deck. You'll see. Now, of course, we're playing 4 copies of Bart. There's 3 Ellis. There's 3 copies of Vran in the deck. That's true of every single deck that we're playing, and I think I've made that point enough. So what sets this deck apart from all the other decks? What makes it so aggro, man? Well, first of all, I want to go ahead and tell you we're playing 3 copies of Adaline in this deck. We already did that in the Legends deck. It's not like you haven't seen it yet or anything, but in this deck specifically, Adaline is super juiced to the moon. This thing gets enormous in this list, and obviously it provides a bunch of tokens. We want those. But another card that goes into the aggro build that I was actually really reticent to include in the first place, but then in the end it turned out it's the key to the deck, is Mtg Soul Ripper. I'm only playing 3 copies of this, although I should point out that the only other person playing aristocrats in the entire world right now has also 5-0'd an MTGO League with an aristocrats build that includes 4 copies of Mtg Soul Ripper. So that was a little bit of validation from my viewpoint when I saw that happen. Mtg has been really, really good. Basically, after any of our 1-drops, or if we go Mtg on 2, right, and then we can swing with it on 3, and usually that means playing a Bartolome and another 1-drop, and the 1-drop crews this. And yes, there are in fact 1-drops in this deck that crew this card, like Cult Conscript. Did you forget that this card existed? I didn't. I love skeletons. I also like a card that allows us to do sort of commander-ish aristocrats tricks, right? If we got enough mana, we can just keep getting this back from our graveyard over and over and keep getting dies, triggers, sacrificing the Bartolome, getting extra counters and all that. And none of the other decks really have access to a piece like that we can grind with. And oddly enough, the aggro deck ended up with that piece, not only because it has the highest power, and I like playing a Savannah Lions and aggro, but also because it can crew the Mtg Soul Ripper, sacrifice to it, and then just come back later. Now, there's a total of 11 1-drops in this deck. That means that we've got 7 besides the 4 copies of Cult Conscripts. But this is where it gets a little weird in terms of the numbers, because I'm playing 2 copies of Yoshin Frontliner, 2 copies of Ruin Lurker Bat, and then 3 copies of Crawling Chorus. Now, this deck, much like the other decks, also needs to get as many bodies as it can out of its non-Bart, non-Ellis, non-Vron cards. So Crawling Chorus ended up in this deck, but no other deck, kind of surprisingly. There's just better 1-drops for most of the other decks that we're playing, but I just didn't find as many slots to juice the number of creatures that we're playing. Like, there's no Lord Skitter in this deck, there's no Jadar in this deck, right? So I needed some other cards that can leave creatures behind or put other creatures into play. That's why you see the 3 Crawling Chorus. Aside from that, though, the other 2 1-drops were on here. I could not decide between, and I really like them both. Yoshin Frontliner is just super sick in this deck. deck, not only can it make something a little bit bigger when it swings, which is better than you think, but also you can just sacrifice this and then bring it back and then sacrifice it again if that's what you want to do. You can only do that once, but turns out that's a pretty important line, man. Yoshin Frontliner. I'm really kind of eyeing for some of these other lists now because it was such an impressive one drop in this deck, but Rune Lurker Bad is pretty sweet too. One of the reasons this is so good in this deck is not only does it give us those sweet scries and all that, but mostly, this can attack alongside Adeline, or at least the same turn you play Adeline, right? You really want 1 and 2 drops that can attack, if not profitably every turn, they can at least attack somewhat safely. And this 1-drop flyer is actually one of the safest creatures to send through on turn 3 after you drop an Adeline, and that really increases its stock in this deck. Now, I should tell you that we're playing 4 Sanguine Evangelist in this deck and 4 Rite of Oblivion, but you already knew that. We've got a few more slots left over, though, and I'm going to fill them with 3 copies of Voldaren Bloodcaster, of all things. I, again, was very impressed by this. This Cruza Mokultai Soul Ripper, for what that's worth, and I think it's worth at least something, but this also just throws artifacts into play, which you can then sacrifice to your Bart if you want to make him bigger. If you don't, you can just draw cards and discard cards off the blood tokens. Turns out that's good too. But this is also a 2-mana, 2-power flyer, so yet again a pretty safe thing to send through once you get an Adeline down, right? The turn you play Adeline on 3, well, you played this on 2, you send it through, you get a token, Adeline gets a little bit bigger. It's all sweet. Most of this deck is actually about setting up Adeline on turn 3 while still like obeying the aristocrats conceit. So this is probably the deck that pushes through the most damage in the early game. And it turns out that cards like Ellis Okor and Vron really appreciate that once you get to the mid and late game. Altogether, this was pretty easily the best version of this deck that we were able to put together for this video. I mean, the traditional deck did fairly well against all the aggro decks in the format, but so did Life Game, so did this one. The Legends deck did the worst. I would say it was easily the worst deck that I've presented to you, but it's also the most fun when it gets going. All that said, though, again, this one came together to give me all the elements that I kind of wanted out of the traditional deck. You know what I mean? This one is fast. Again, it pushes through damage pretty quickly in the relative early game, especially if you're not playing against aggro. But if you are playing against aggro, the Aristocrats deck is actually pretty effective against them for all the reasons I've already outlined, you know? You're going to put them in a situation where not only are you gaining life off of multiple of your cards, but also they kind of can't get through on your defenses because if your guys die, they're dead. So again, this deck, if it needs to kind of fall back into that ancillary mode of Aristocrats, can do that, but it can also just keep its foot on the gas and keep tapping its creatures, turning them sideways and hitting the opponent for damage. And it can do that because it's got like 5 main deck flyers plus an effective 2-mana 5-power Menace in Mokultai Soul Ripper. It's got Sanguine Evangelist, which makes more flyers and becomes an Anthem effect that actually matters because you're actually attacking in this deck. I think it leverages Sanguine Evangelist the best out of all of these. Just really does a number on them, plays enough 1-drops to actually start attacking. It's the only deck that plays a 2-power 1-drop that can keep coming back. Just deck really has a lot going for it here, and it was one of the ones that I not only had the most fun with, but definitely the one I got the most wins with. But with that, I think we actually pulled it off, everybody. I have been nervous about doing triple techs in the past, so I can't really tell you how nervous I was to do a quadruple tech, and will anybody even watch it? I'm not sure. Let me know if you're watching in the comment section, but anyway, that's all I've really got for this one. That is, in fact, Allski Kowalski. But is that Itsky Lewitsky? Not quite yet, because I have to do more call to action stuff. And remember, again, there's going to be links in the description for every single one of these decks if you want to look over them again without having to watch like a however long video this is at this point. I don't even want to guess. No, it's probably long. So if you don't want to watch me run my mouth for another 40 minutes? Is that where we are at this point? And again, links in the description. You can check out all these decks, pick them up on TCG Player, and that'll help me out because I'm affiliated with them. Aside from that, you can do all the other YouTube stuff, just like the video. If you enjoyed my stuff, make sure you're subbed to the channel, hit the bell for the recommendations so that when I put videos out, they actually end up in your recommended feed. That's a kind of important thing. You can also check me out on Twitch where I'll be playing Magic, maybe Thanksgiving night. I might do that, but I'll definitely be playing Magic this weekend, so check me out over there. And of course, you can hit up the Patreon where it's just $1 a month to vote on stuff. That's why we're doing this deck. You think I just want to do Aristocrats all the time? You're correct. I do want to do that, but also the patrons voted for it. Man, should we go back to the couch? Have we had enough of the stand-up comedy routine? This just feels right. It feels natural. It feels like old times, and I like that because I'm old. But anyway, just let me know how you felt about all the stuff today in this video. If you've got an Aristocrats list that's different from these and I somehow didn't see it, then hit me up in the comment section. Let me know because I'm really interested in that. That would have to be really wacky. But anyway, I'm basically donezo for this onezo. I still had one in my back pocket. But anyway, that's all I got for this one, y'all. So let me know how you felt about it, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.